Hey guys, welcome back to the second of the mini video lessons on biodiversity. So the purpose of today's lesson is one, to talk about what a hybrid is. Two, to recognize the need for multiple definitions of a species. And lastly, we're going to look at some practice questions for the dataset and the final exam. We left off here last video, and although we've talked about the answer in class, let's just recap. So the answer we said was D. Let's talk about why and how we got there. So biodiversity is recognized as the total variety of A. Species interrelationships, biotic and abiotic factors. This is in some way correct. However, is it the most correct answer? No. Species interrelationships. So this is talking about the ways in which organisms, species, interact with each other. But what about different species interacting with each other? It's the same thing as ecological processes, really. But there's more to it than just this. And biotic and abiotic factors, yes, they do make up ecosystems, and ecosystems do make up biodiversity. However, there's again more to it. So B, communities of organisms occupying major habitats. Does biodiversity just refer to major habitats? No, it refers to the variety of life, so that can be very minor as well. C, regions of surface and atmosphere occupied by organisms. Just kind of irrelevant, really. And D, biodiversity refers to organisms. Yes, variety of organisms, variety of habitats, communities, and the way in which these things all interact with each other is our answer here. So, the second question, this is taken from the short response paper of the QCAA mock exam. So you can expect to see a question very similar to this, or at least like it in a format on the exam. Describe 4 features of Carl Linnaeus' system of classification. Describe. Although the answers here are brief, they're just consolidated versions of what you would write. So number 1, it has hierarchical structure, and that means it's got subsections. We spoke about how there are 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. It uses the binomial nomenclature system for naming. Bi meaning 2, nomial meaning name, and nomenclature, the way in which it all kind of works. This is referring to the scientific name of a species. And it also is based on physical features. For example, chordata refers to the backbone, a physical feature. So we'll keep moving on to our learning goals. To recognize the need for multiple definitions of a species. So we've spoken about how there are various ways to classify a species. One was the system we just looked at, but it can also be based on methods of reproduction, sexual, asexual. It can also be based on molecular sequencing. So genetics can show us that, yeah, these 2 species are actually more similar than what we first thought. This is a minor point, but I'll talk on it for a moment anyway. The scientific naming binomial nomenclature system can be a bit confusing, even though it's great universally. So this example of a white egret and a white eucalyptus tree. The white part of this name is expressed in the word elba. Both have the word elba in their species name. However, the genus part of the name does vary. Idea elba, eucalyptus elba. Minor part is better examples of why we have multiple definitions, such as a mutation. Small permanent changes in the DNA of an organism are also relevant in this, because if we looked at these zebra finches, for example, or different types of finches here, a golden zebra finch, saw a little, it's called a charm, a group of these guys out at Uluru one time. It was really cool. They were feeding on a local little waterhole. But anyway, so these features can vary, mutate over time. This is an example of microevolution where Darwin did a lot of his work around. And so if we base our definition and our species name on a physical feature, it's possible that it could change. So it's helpful to have different ways in which we classify species. And also, thirdly, some bacteria and sexual organisms just cannot be classified by one means. And there are also genetic advances changing the way in which we have previously classified organisms. Remember, sexual refers to when there were two parents needed to pass on genetic coding for the offspring. So, next point, we're going to look at this. Identify one example of an interspecific hybrid that does not produce fertile offspring. A couple of key terms here we'll look at in a moment as well. An example of a hybrid is a mule. It's handy to take a moment now just to define what the word species actually means. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed with each other to produce fertile and living offspring. So a definition for fertile just means the ability to produce its own offspring. The opposite of that would be infertile, right? And you've probably heard of examples of couples trying to fall pregnant but struggling with infertility. Normally, species interbreed with the same species, but it has been known that in artificial situations, such as in a zoo, two different species, such as possibly in this case a leopard and a lion, can interbreed. Other examples include what looks to be a zebra and a donkey, in this case a lion and a tiger, again in an artificial situation, and the mule, so this would be a donkey and a horse. They have bred this new species. But as a result of two different species coming together, we call each of these a hybrid. And the thing with hybrids is that, yes, they can live normal lives. However, they are unable to produce their own young. And so we would say hybrids are therefore infertile. So the term the whole idea that we've been discussing is called reproductive isolation. And it just refers to the inability of two different species to successfully produce their own fertile and living young. So they have produced their own young in this case, but they are all infertile themselves. So, okay, and you're unlikely to see this kind of hybrid, but there's another example. So a couple of practice questions. The first assessment piece that we have is the data test, and it is taking place for us in week 8. So I'm just going to start introducing a few kind of questions that you may be asked so that we can work on the skills that you will need. So a bit of background information first. It's worth 10% of your final grade. It's 60 minutes plus 10 minutes of perusal time. And it will include short response questions based on data that you're given. So whether that's tables or graphs. And you're also going to need to know your cognitive verbs. So I'll start bringing a few of those into these PowerPoints and videos as well. Let's look at one cognitive verb today. It is compare. So to compare, whenever you're asked to compare, it means more than probably what we've been doing previously. It means to display recognition of similarities and differences and recognize the significance of these similarities and differences. Let's practice that. So, data test practice. Question. This is taken from Khan Academy as well, so just credit to them, and you can also follow the link that I'll put up in a moment if you want to further read on this. So, there's a graph here. On the horizontal or x-axis, we have an environmental condition. So that could be anything. That could be the amount of salts in the water, the salinity. It could be the pH of the water, talking about water in this case because it's a fish. It could also refer to the amount of oxygen. So let's go with that for this example of environmental condition. On the y-axis, we are looking at the number of individuals from low to high, graph 1, species 1. Here you can see that, well, the number of individuals is greatest in the middle section of this. So moderate levels of oxygen levels are most viable for this species to reproduce because there's the greater number scale over here. Let's look at a second graph. Again, same condition. Let's say this is, again, oxygen levels and number up the side, a different species here. Graph number 2. So you're given a bunch of data right here, and you're asked to interpret this to make sense of it. In this case, we're going to compare. So your question is to compare the two graphs, inferring which species has the greatest survival rate in which condition. Question 1. Which species would be more adapted to prolonged exposure to higher levels of oxygen? Question 2. Which species is least adapted to low, moderate levels of oxygen? So you can pause the video here and answer these. We're going to go through these in class. So I'll keep moving on for now. And there is the link. And that's all for now. So hopefully, again, I haven't lost you. And of course, we'll go over this in class. And I'll see you then. All the best.